There is a name that belongs to no country and no century, a name older than most of the words we use to speak about the past. It has no passport, no resting place, no museum where you might visit its remains behind glass. And yet it lives, quietly, in nearly every language and every corner of human memory. Tonight, if you are comfortable, if the room around you is still and the light is soft, let yourself settle a little deeper into wherever you are. There is no hurry in this story. The water is patient. The ruins have waited for thousands of years already, and the mystery has outlived every empire that tried to solve it. Atlantis. Say the word aloud, slowly, and something stirs beneath the surface of ordinary thought. Not quite history, not quite legend. A place that shimmers between what was real and what was wished for, between what scholars can prove and what storytellers across millennia have refused to forget. It is perhaps the oldest missing place on Earth. Others have vanished and left behind their bones. Pottery cracked by time in the dust of Turkey, stone walls softened by monsoon rains in Cambodia, inscriptions worn to silence by the patient wind of the Arabian desert. Egypt left its pyramids standing in the sun. Rome left its roads cutting across 3 continents. Even Troy, that city of Homer's golden poetry, once dismissed for centuries as a poet's beautiful invention, eventually surrendered its layered walls beneath a hill called Hisarlik in the northwest corner of Turkey. A man with a shovel proved the poets right. The stones were real. The war, in some form, had happened. But Atlantis has left nothing. No column half buried in sand, no coin bearing the face of a forgotten king, no fragment of a wall rising from the seabed, encrusted in coral and barnacles. Nothing at all, only a story written down by a Greek philosopher 24 centuries ago in 2 dialogues that he never even finished. And yet that absence, that perfect and total silence where evidence should be, has done something that no artifact ever could. It has kept the question alive. It has kept the lantern burning in the window of human curiosity for over 2,000 years, drawing explorers and dreamers and skeptics toward a door that never quite opens. Why does this story endure when so many others have faded? Perhaps because it speaks to something deeper than curiosity about a single place. Beneath every question about Atlantis lies a suspicion that the world was once more wondrous than it is now, that somewhere in the vast darkness before our records began, human beings built something extraordinary, and then lost it, completely, in a single day and night of earthquake and flood. According to the story, an entire civilization slid beneath the waves and vanished so thoroughly that not a single trace remained above the waterline. The sea closed over it, the way sleep closes over a dream, leaving nothing behind but the faintest outline in the memory. Every culture on Earth seems to carry its own version of this feeling. A golden age that came before the fall, a garden from which we were expelled, a kingdom swallowed by water. The details shift from tradition to tradition. The Sumerians told of Dilmun, the Hindus of a primordial age of truth, the Chinese of an era of sage kings. But the shape remains the same. Something great was built. Something went wrong. The waters rose. And now we stand on the far side of that loss, telling the story to our children in the dark, wondering if it was ever really true, knowing that the wondering itself matters more than any answer we might find. Atlantis sits at the center of that wondering, like a stone dropped into perfectly still water. The ripples have been spreading outward for 24 centuries, from Plato's Athens to the courts of Renaissance princes, from the lecture halls of modern universities to the glowing screens of late-night internet searches. Explorers have sought it in the warm shallows of the Mediterranean and the crushing depths of the mid-Atlantic ridge. Divers have followed its ghost to the waters off Japan, off Cuba, off the Bahamas. Satellite analysts have stared at concentric rings in the Saharan dust and wondered whether a desert could hide an ocean's secret. None of them have found it, and none of them have stopped looking. The absence of proof has never weakened the pull. If anything, it has strengthened it, because a mystery that can be solved is merely a puzzle, but a mystery that resists all solution becomes something closer to myth. And myth is the language in which human beings speak their deepest truths. Was Atlantis real? Was it invented? Was it something in between? A true catastrophe dressed in philosophy. A distant memory reshaped by centuries of retelling until it became unrecognizable. A warning wrapped inside a wonder. These questions have been asked by some of the finest minds in the Western tradition, and they remain unanswered. The ocean at night is a dark mirror. Stand at the edge of any shore after sunset, and you will see only the surface. The slow roll of waves catching starlight, the white edge of foam dissolving into sand. But beneath that surface lies a world we can barely imagine, a silence that holds everything the land has ever forgotten. Somewhere in that silence, according to the oldest telling, the story of Atlantis begins. Not with proof, not with coordinates on a map, but with a voice. An old man's voice, telling a younger man a story he first heard when he was 9 years old at a family gathering in Athens, from a grandfather who had heard it from a statesman who had heard it from priests in Egypt. That chain of voices stretching across centuries is where our journey begins. And if you will stay a while, and let the room grow quiet, and let the day's concerns settle like silt to the bottom of a still pool, we will follow those voices together. From a temple on the Nile to a philosopher's writing chamber in Athens. And then outward, past the pillars of Heracles, past the edge of the known world, into the wide and unmapped Atlantic, to the island that no ship has reached in living memory, and yet no story, in any language, has ever quite released from its grip. The current is gentle. The journey is long. Let the world outside your window grow distant now. Let the hum of the day dissolve into the hum of the sea. There is only the story, and the softness of the dark, and the slow, patient rhythm of the tide, pulling gently at the edge of memory. Chapter 2, The Chain of Whispers, Solon, Egypt, and Plato. In the 6th century before the Common Era, a man named Solon left Athens. He was not fleeing danger, and he was not driven out by enemies. He was, by most accounts, one of the most respected men in the city, a lawmaker whose reforms had reshaped Athenian society, a poet whose verses were admired, a statesman trusted by nearly all factions. But political life in Athens was exhausting, and Solon had recently completed the great work of his career. A new constitution, a new legal code, a new framework for how citizens would live together. He had asked the Athenians to observe his laws for 10 years without alteration, and then he had stepped aside, perhaps wisely, to let the city find its own way. He traveled east, as many educated Greeks did in those years, toward the ancient civilizations of the Nile and the Levant. The world beyond Greece was old in a way that no Greek city could comprehend. Where Athens measured its history in a few hundred years, the kingdoms along the Nile measured theirs in thousands. Solon came to Sais, a city in the western Nile delta. Sais was the seat of the goddess Neith, whom the Greeks associated with their own Athena, a goddess of wisdom, of war conducted with strategy rather than rage, of the loom and the spear held in the same steady hand. The temple at Sais was one of the oldest in Egypt. Imagine the interior of that temple in the late afternoon light. Columns thick as ancient oaks, painted in fading colors that had been old when the Trojan War was fought. lamps burning in alcoves, the smell of incense layered into stone by centuries of ritual, the quiet footsteps of priests who had spent their lives guarding records that no living Greek had ever seen. Solon sat with these priests and spoke of the past. He told them the oldest stories the Greeks possessed, tales of Deucalion and the Great Flood, of Pharaonius, whom some called the first man, of the creation of the world as Greek tradition understood it. He spoke with pride, as a man does, when sharing the treasures of his own civilization. The priests listened without interrupting. When Solon had finished, one of them, an old man whose name history has not preserved, looked at the Athenian visitor and said something that has echoed through 24 centuries of human thought. The words, as Plato recorded them, were gentle but devastating. "You Greeks," the priest said, "are always children. There is no old man among you. Your souls are young. You possess no ancient learning, no knowledge gray with time. Your civilization forgets itself again and again, swept clean by floods and fires, rebuilt each time by survivors who carry nothing of what came before." The priest explained that the Greeks had endured many catastrophes, natural upheavals that periodically destroyed the cities of the plains and the coasts, leaving only the illiterate mountain dwellers alive. Each rebirth was a fresh start, a new beginning without memory. Egypt, by contrast, sheltered by the steady rhythms of the Nile, had been spared these cycles of destruction. And then, in the lamplight of that ancient temple, the priest told Solon a story that would outlive them both. He told him about Athens itself. Not the Athens Solon knew, but a different Athens, one that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's time. An Athens that was virtuous, disciplined, well-governed, and militarily powerful beyond anything the current city could imagine. And that ancient Athens, the priest said, had once faced a terrible enemy, an enemy from beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the narrow strait where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, the passage we now call Gibraltar. There, in the open ocean beyond, lay an island of extraordinary size and power. The priest spoke its name quietly, and 24 centuries later we are still repeating it. Atlantis. An island larger, the priest said, than Libya and Asia Minor combined, commanding wealth and military strength unlike anything the Greeks of Solon's day could imagine. The island commanded a civilization of astonishing wealth and technological sophistication. Its kings ruled not only their own land, but much of the Mediterranean coast, parts of Libya as far as Egypt, and parts of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. They built a navy that dominated the seas and an army that seemed unstoppable. But Athens, small and alone after its allies had fallen away, stood firm against the Atlantean invasion. In a conflict whose details the priest did not elaborate, Athens defeated the invaders and liberated the peoples they had conquered. It was, in the priest's telling, the finest hour of a civilization that the modern Greeks had entirely forgotten. And then came the catastrophe. In a single day and night of violent earthquakes and floods, the warrior race of Athens sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. In its place, the priest said, the ocean was impassable, choked with mud and shoals, so that no ship could sail where the island had once stood. Solon listened. He took notes, on papyrus, perhaps, or on wax tablets carried in the leather satchel of a traveling statesman. Some ancient sources suggest he began to shape what he heard into a poem, a grand epic that would rival Homer. But the poem was never completed. Solon returned to Athens, and the story passed quietly into the keeping of his family. From Solon, the account traveled to a relative named Dropides. From Dropides, it passed to Critias the elder, and from Critias the elder, it reached a boy of 9 years old. Critias the Younger, at an Athenian family festival called the Apaturia, somewhere around 451 years before the Common Era. The Apaturia was a 3-day festival celebrating kinship and the bonds between generations. Imagine a warm autumn evening in Athens, oil lamps flickering in a courtyard, the voices of relatives rising and falling in conversation. A boy sits near the edge of the gathering, close enough to his grandfather to feel the old man's warmth. The grandfather, Critias the Elder, was nearly 90. His voice was thin with age but steady with the authority of a man who had lived through the most turbulent decades of Athenian history. He began to tell a story he had heard from his own grandfather, Dropides, who had it from the private papers of Solon himself. The boy listened. He was 9 years old, the age at which stories take root in the deepest soil of memory, the age at which a tale heard in firelight can shape an entire life. He would carry this story with him for decades, through wars, through political upheaval, through the long education of an Athenian aristocrat who moved in the circles of philosophers. Eventually, that boy, now a man grown old in his turn, told the story to Plato, and Plato, the philosopher who had already written about justice and the ideal state, about love and the nature of reality, about the cave and the sun and the divided line, sat down and recorded it. He set the account in 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, placing the story in the mouth of his character, Critias the Younger, who tells it to Socrates as part of a broader conversation about the nature of the ideal city and its relationship to the real world. The Timaeus gives a brief, compressed version of the Atlantis story, tucked within a vast cosmological discussion about the origin of the universe. The Critias, which follows, is entirely different. It is a detailed, architectural, almost loving description of the island, its geography, its city, its government, its religion, and the first stirrings of its moral decline. But the Critias is unfinished. The dialogue breaks off in mid-sentence, just as Zeus has summoned the gods to discuss the punishment of the Atlanteans. The last words of the text describe the king of the gods looking down upon the corruption of a once noble race, and then silence. The scroll ends. The sentence hangs incomplete in the air of 24 centuries. Whether Plato abandoned the work deliberately, was drawn away by other philosophical projects, grew ill, or simply died before the final pages were written, no one knows. The unfinished ending of the Critias is one of the great unsolved puzzles of ancient literature. A door left ajar in a house that has otherwise been carefully locked. What we are left with, then, is a story passed through at least 5 pairs of hands. From Egyptian priest to Solon, from Solon to Dropides, from Dropides to Critias the Elder, from the elder to the younger, and from the younger to Plato, across roughly 2 centuries of human time. Each transmission introduced the possibility of embellishment, simplification, or silent distortion. Scholars have debated the nature of this account for as long as the text has been read. One school holds that Plato invented Atlantis entirely, a philosophical parable designed to illustrate the dangers of empire, the corruption of power, and the inevitable fall of civilizations that abandon virtue for ambition. Athens, in this reading, is the hero. Atlantis is the cautionary tale. Another tradition argues that the extraordinary precision of Plato's description, the exact dimensions of the canals measured in stadia, the specific metals used to clad the walls, the arrangement of the concentric rings, the particular species of trees and animals, points to a source more concrete than philosophical imagination. No fabulist, these scholars say, invents measurements. A third position, increasingly favored in recent decades, suggests that Plato drew upon a genuine historical memory, Perhaps the catastrophic eruption of Thera and the collapse of the Minoan civilization, events that occurred roughly 1,000 years before his time, and reshaped that memory into a philosophical narrative, altering the scale, the geography, and the timeline to serve his argument. The truth, if there is a single truth, may lie somewhere in the space between these readings. What we can say with certainty is this: the only ancient source for Atlantis is Plato. No Egyptian record confirming the account has ever been discovered. No independent Greek text corroborates the story. Aristotle, Plato's own student, reportedly regarded the entire tale as invention. And yet the story refuses to behave like a simple fable. Its architectural detail, its hydrological specificity, its careful attention to military organization and trade networks, these feel less like philosophy and more like memory. Distorted memory, perhaps. Amplified memory. But memory nonetheless, carrying within it the echo of something once seen or known or heard from a source that no longer survives. In whatever room Plato worked, with its scrolls stacked in cedar boxes, its stylus and wax, its view of a city that had itself risen and fallen and risen again, a philosopher sat and recorded a vanished world. A world of concentric rings and shining water, of golden temples, and a metal unlike any the Greeks could name. He wrote of kings who were the sons of a god, of harbors filled with ships from distant lands, and of an ocean that closed over everything in a single terrible night. That world is where we are going next. The chain of whispers has carried us to the threshold. Beyond it lies the island itself, its mountains thick with forest, its plains golden with harvest, its harbors alive with the sails of distant traders, and at its center, the city of rings, gleaming like a jewel set in the wide, dark body of the sea. Chapter 3: The Island Beyond the Pillars. Beyond the strait that the ancients called the Pillars of Heracles, where the rock of Gibraltar rises on one side and the cliffs of Morocco on the other, the Mediterranean ends and the Atlantic begins. In Plato's day, this was the edge of the known world. Beyond it lay only rumor, fog, and the sound of deep water moving under an open sky. It was here, according to the Egyptian priests, that Atlantis once stood. Not a small island, not a rocky outcrop in the shipping lanes, but a landmass of staggering size. Larger, Plato wrote, than Libya and Asia Minor put together. A continent in all but name, rising from the Atlantic in a place where no modern chart has ever found it. Plato described this island with the attention of a man who had either seen a detailed map or listened very carefully to someone who had. It was rich beyond measure. The plains were fertile, the forests thick with timber, the mountains laced with streams that poured down into valleys full of wild game and flowering meadows. The soil produced 2 harvests a year, one watered by the rains of winter, one fed by the irrigation channels that the Atlanteans had carved across the land. Fruit trees grew in abundance. Herbs filled the meadows with scent. Even elephants roamed the forests, which strikes the modern reader as an odd detail for an Atlantic island, but which Plato set down without comment. The mountains sheltered deposits of every useful metal. Quarries yielded stone in 3 colors, red, white, and black, which the builders of the capital would later use to construct walls of remarkable beauty. Rivers ran clean from the highlands to the sea, carrying minerals that settled in the riverbeds like scattered offerings. But the story of Atlantis does not begin with its people or their achievements. It begins with a god. Poseidon, lord of the sea and of earthquakes, received the island as his portion when the gods divided the earth among themselves. He came to the island and found there a mortal woman named Cleito, living on a hill near the center of the great plain. The god fell in love with her, and to protect the hill where she lived, Poseidon shaped the land itself, carving alternating rings of sea and earth around the central hill so that no man could reach her. 2 rings of earth, 3 rings of water, all perfectly concentric, encircling the hill like the rings of a great tree cut open by time. From their union came 10 sons, born in 5 pairs of twins. The firstborn of the eldest pair was named Atlas, and to him Poseidon gave dominion over the central island and the surrounding region. The entire ocean and the island took his name, the Atlantic, the Sea of Atlas. Each of the other 9 sons received a portion of the island to govern. These 10 kings and their descendants ruled Atlantis for many generations. The government was neither a single tyranny nor a loose confederation, but something in between. A council of 10 sovereigns bound together by sacred laws that Poseidon himself had inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the center of the island. Every 5th and 6th year, alternately, the 10 kings would gather at the temple of Poseidon to consult on matters of governance and justice. Before their deliberations, they performed a ritual that Plato described with an almost ceremonial precision. A ritual involving sacred bulls that roamed freely within the temple grounds. The kings, armed only with staves and nooses and forbidden to use any weapon of metal, would hunt one of the bulls in the darkness of the temple precinct. When they caught it, they led it to the pillar of orichalcum and slaughtered it there, letting the blood flow over the inscribed laws while they swore their oaths of justice and allegiance. Afterward, in golden cups, they mingled the bull's blood with wine and poured libations into the fire. They drank from the cup, each king in turn, and dedicated the golden vessels to the temple. Then, in the dim light of the dying fire, with the inscription gleaming faintly in the blood-dark liquid, they sat in judgment over one another. No king could punish or execute a fellow king without the consent of the majority. Their power was bound by consent, their authority rooted in ritual, their legitimacy drawn not from conquest but from a divine origin that the people of the island accepted as the foundation of all law. For many generations, Plato tells us, this system held. The divine nature inherited from Poseidon remained strong in the bloodline of the kings. They were virtuous. They valued wisdom over wealth and regarded their immense riches as a burden rather than a prize. The weight of gold did not distort their judgment. They bore the prosperity of their civilization lightly, as something given rather than earned, knowing that true excellence lay not in possessions but in character. Plato's language here is tender, almost mournful. The description of a society at its peak, seen from the far side of its destruction, remembered in the past tense by a philosopher who already knew how the story ended. The island was divided into 10 districts, each governed by one of the 10 royal houses. The laws prescribed the military contribution of each district, soldiers, chariots, horses, ships, and the central plain was divided into 60,000 lots, each responsible for supplying a leader and his contingent in time of war. The Great Plain itself stretched 2,000 stadia in one direction and 3,000 in another, an expanse roughly equivalent to a modern rectangle of 220 miles by 330 miles. It was surrounded by mountains on 3 sides and open to the sea on the south, sheltered from the north wind and blessed with a temperate climate. Across this plain ran a vast network of irrigation canals, laid out in straight lines and connected by cross-channels so that the entire surface could be watered and drained according to the season. Boats moved along these canals, carrying timber from the mountains and produce from the farms, and the plain hummed with the quiet industry of a civilization that had mastered its landscape. This was the island, This was the world that Poseidon built for the woman he loved and the sons she bore him. A world of extraordinary natural wealth, governed by divine law, sustained by engineering that Plato described with the precision of a man reading from a blueprint rather than composing a fable. And at the center of this world, on the very hill where Plato once lived alone, the Atlanteans built something that no other civilization of the ancient world could match. A city of concentric rings, shining with metal and stone, that rose from the water like a vision made solid by the hands of men who remembered they were the children of a god. Chapter 4: The City of Rings. Imagine approaching the capital of Atlantis from the sea. You are standing on the deck of a merchant ship, perhaps a vessel carrying goods from the distant coasts of the Mediterranean. The sun is behind you, and ahead through the morning haze, the city is beginning to appear, not all at once, but in layers, like a painting revealing itself as you draw closer. The first thing you would see is the mouth of the Great Canal. It was 50 stadia long, roughly 5.5 miles, and 300 feet wide, cutting straight from the open sea to the outermost ring of water. Deep enough, Plato said, to admit the largest ships of the age. Its stone banks rose above the waterline, and along them stood watchtowers and gates that controlled the flow of traffic. As your ship enters the canal, the land closes in on both sides. The air changes. The open salt wind of the Atlantic gives way to something warmer, touched with the smell of blossoming trees and the faint scent of wood smoke from the workshops along the banks. Other ships are moving ahead of you and behind you, their sails catching the breeze that funnels through the channel. At the end of the canal, the outermost ring of water opens before you like a vast circular harbor. This ring was the widest of the three stadia across, according to Plato's measurements. Ships from every corner of the known world gathered here, their hulls rocking gently in water that never grew rough, sheltered as it was by the concentric rings of land. The noise of this outer harbor was the noise of commerce. Merchants calling out their wares in a dozen languages. The creak of wooden cranes lifting cargo from holds. The clatter of amphorae being stacked on stone quays. Sailors mending nets in the shade of warehouses built into the base of the outer wall. This was the commercial heart of the island, the place where the wealth of Atlantis met the needs of the world. Rising above the harbor, the outer wall encircled the city like a massive stone bracelet. It was built from the island's own quarries. Blocks of red, white, and black stone, fitted together with a craftsmanship that Plato described as both beautiful and formidable. The outer surface of this wall was covered in brass, so that it gleamed dully in the sun like a shield hung on a giant's arm. Beyond the outer wall lay the first ring of land. Here stood houses and gardens, temples and public buildings, connected by bridges that spanned the water rings at intervals. The bridges were wide enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast, and beneath them ran tunnels through which ships could move from one ring of water to the next, without lowering their masts. The second ring of water was narrower than the first, 2 stadia across, and the second ring of land, between the second and third water rings, was narrower still. Each ring brought you closer to the center, and with each step inward, the architecture grew more refined, the materials more precious, the silence more profound. The wall surrounding the second ring of land was clad not in brass but in tin, so that it shone with a cooler, more silver light than the outer wall. The buildings here were fewer but grander. Residences of the noble families, perhaps, or administrative halls, where the business of the 10 kingdoms was conducted in chambers lined with polished stone. The innermost ring of water was only 1 stadium across, and beyond it rose the central island. The citadel, the sacred heart of the entire civilization, the very hill where Poseidon had once carved the rings of earth and sea to shelter the mortal woman he loved. It was here that the greatest structures of Atlantis stood. The wall encircling the citadel was covered in orichalcum, the mysterious metal that Plato said was second in value only to gold. It flashed, he wrote, with a red light, a warm glow that distinguished it from both gold and bronze. Against the white stone of the buildings behind it, the orichalcum wall must have looked like a ring of sunset captured and frozen in metal. Within the citadel stood the Temple of Poseidon, the spiritual and architectural crown of the civilization. Plato described it as one stadium in length, roughly 600 feet, and half a stadium in width, with a height proportionate to its footprint. Its exterior was covered entirely in silver, except for the pinnacles, which were sheathed in gold, and caught the first and last light of each day. Step inside the temple, and the world outside disappeared. The ceiling was made of ivory, inlaid with patterns of gold, silver, and orichalcum that caught the light of oil lamps and scattered it across the walls in shifting constellations. Every surface, the walls, the pillars, the floor beneath your feet was coated in orichalcum, so that the interior glowed with a warm, reddish light unlike anything in the Greek world. And at the center of the temple stood the statue, a golden Poseidon, so tall that his head touched the roof of the building, standing in a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses. The god held the reins in one hand and a trident in the other, and around him, arranged in a circle, were 100 nereids, sea nymphs riding on the backs of dolphins, each figure cast in gold. The statue was not merely decorative. It was a declaration, a statement, rendered in precious metal and mythic imagery, that this civilization owed its existence to a god, and that its power flowed from the divine order of the sea. The winged horses suggested flight beyond the mortal realm. The dolphins suggested mastery of the deep. The 100 nereids suggested a kingdom that extended beneath the waves as surely as it ruled above them. Outside the temple, the citadel held other wonders. There were sacred groves where the trees had been planted by the earliest kings. There were exercise grounds for athletes and training fields for horses. There were separate bathing pools, one for the king, one for the citizens, one for women, one even for horses and cattle, fed by natural springs that Poseidon had caused to flow from the central hill. 2 springs rose from the earth at the center of the citadel, one hot, one cold. The Atlanteans channeled them through aqueducts into cisterns and bathing pools, using the warm water for washing in winter, and the cool water for drinking and for irrigating the sacred gardens that surrounded the temple. Steam rose from the hot springs in the early morning, mingling with the smoke of incense from the altars, so that the citadel in the first hour of daylight seemed to float above the earth in its own private cloud, half hidden from the ordinary world below. The palace of the kings stood near the temple, enclosed within the citadel walls. Plato described it as having been continuously improved by each generation of rulers, each king striving to surpass the beauty of his predecessor's additions. Over the centuries, the palace had grown into a complex of extraordinary size and richness, a living record of the dynasty's ambition written in stone and metal. Surrounding the citadel and extending outward through the rings, the city's infrastructure hummed with quiet efficiency. Docks lined the inner edges of the water rings, crowded with warships and merchant vessels. Storehouses held timber, rope, pitch, and provisions. Barracks housed the garrison. Smithies rang with the sound of hammers shaping bronze and orichalcum into tools, weapons, and ornaments. The entire system, rings, bridges, tunnels, canals, harbors, walls, aqueducts, drainage channels, represented an achievement in urban planning that Plato clearly intended his readers to find remarkable. This was not a city that had grown haphazardly, the way most ancient cities did. It was designed, planned, engineered with a sophistication that implied deep understanding of hydrology, architecture, and military defense. And yet this gleaming, ordered, magnificent city was also, in Plato's telling, a place that had already begun to carry within it the seed of its own destruction. The wealth was too great, the power was too concentrated, the divine blood of Poseidon, diluted over generations of mortal marriage, was growing thin in the veins of the kings. The orichalcum still gleamed on the walls. The springs still flowed from the sacred hill. The ships still filled the harbors, and the bulls still roamed the temple grounds. But something had shifted, something invisible, something that could not be measured in stadia or weighed in gold. The virtue that had once governed this civilization was beginning to fade, like the last warmth of a fire no one has remembered to tend. For now, though, the city of rings still stands in the story as Plato left it. Radiant, precise, impossible and unforgettable. A place that may never have existed anywhere, but in the memory of a chain of voices reaching back to a temple in Egypt. And yet a place so vividly described that it feels, even now, as if you could walk its bridges and hear the water moving beneath them in the dark. Chapter 5. Orichalcum and the Question of Lost Technology. Of all the wonders Plato described, none has haunted the imagination quite like orichalcum. He mentioned it casually, as though naming a substance his readers might have heard of. A metal mined in many parts of Atlantis, second only to gold in value, used to clad the innermost walls and to decorate the floors and pillars of the great temple. He said it flashed with a red light. The Greek word is orichalkos. It means, quite plainly, mountain copper, a name that suggests something dug from highland veins, something that carried the color of the earth it came from. But what exactly was it? Plato did not explain. The priests of Egypt, if they ever described its composition to Solon, left no record that survived. For centuries, scholars assumed orichalcum was simply a poetic name for a copper alloy, something akin to bronze or brass, valued for its warm luster and perhaps for the difficulty of producing it in large quantities. Ancient writers other than Plato mentioned the word occasionally, always in passing, always without providing a clear formula. Then, in 2015, something emerged from the sea floor off the coast of Sicily that changed the tone of the conversation. Marine archaeologists exploring a shipwreck near the port city of Gela, a vessel that had sunk roughly 2,600 years ago, discovered 39 metal ingots scattered across the sandy bottom, glinting faintly in the underwater light. The ingots were analyzed. They were composed of roughly 75 to 80% copper, 14 to 20% zinc, with traces of nickel, lead, and iron. Sebastiano Tusa, then the superintendent of Sicily's sea office, called the find unprecedented. Nothing like these ingots, he said, had ever been recovered from an ancient site before. 2 years later, a second expedition to the same wreck brought up 47 more ingots, bringing the total to 86. They lay in the sand like offerings left at the threshold of a forgotten temple, their surfaces dulled by millennia of salt water, but their composition intact. A brass-like alloy with a reddish cast, consistent with every ancient description of orichalcum that had ever been written. The discovery did not prove that Atlantis existed. Nothing in the wreck pointed to the lost island. But it proved that orichalcum itself was real. Not a poet's invention, not a mythical substance, but an alloy that was produced and traded in the ancient Mediterranean, carried on merchant ships, and valued highly enough to warrant the risk of a sea voyage. This is the strange quality of the Atlantis story. Every time a detail is dismissed as fantasy, some fragment of evidence surfaces, not enough to confirm the whole, but enough to prevent the door from closing entirely. The metal was real. The question of whether the civilization that Plato associated with it was also real remains unanswered. But orichalcum was only one element of a larger puzzle. Plato's description of Atlantis implied a level of technological achievement that, if taken at face value, would place the civilization far ahead of any society known to have existed in the ancient world. Consider the water management systems alone. The concentric rings of water were not merely decorative moats. They were functional infrastructure. Navigable channels that allowed ships to pass from the open sea to the heart of the city served simultaneously as defensive barriers, transportation corridors, and irrigation sources. The hot and cold springs on the central island were channeled through aqueducts into separate bathing facilities for different classes of citizens. The Great Plain beyond the capital was crisscrossed with a grid of irrigation canals so regular that Plato described them in terms that sound more like a modern engineering schematic than a philosopher's parable. Timber was floated down from the mountains on these channels. Crops were watered according to the season. The system implied centralized planning, surveying tools, and an understanding of hydraulic gradients. The military infrastructure was equally striking. The concentric rings served as layered defenses, each wall a further obstacle for any attacker. Plato described garrisons stationed on every ring, patrol boats circling the water channels, and a standing army that included 10,000 chariots, 1,200 warships, and a complex system of conscription that drew soldiers from each of the 60,000 lots of the central plain. To maintain such a force required supply chains, communication systems, training facilities, and the administrative machinery to coordinate them. The quiet, unglamorous backbone of any military power. Plato did not describe these systems in detail, but their existence is implied by everything else he wrote. An army of that size does not feed itself. The agricultural productivity Plato described, a plain so fertile that it yielded 2 harvests a year, a land that produced every variety of fruit and grain, suggested techniques that other civilizations would not develop for centuries. Crop rotation, soil enrichment, possibly even mechanical irrigation. The details are left to the imagination. But the scale of abundance Plato indicated could not have been achieved by primitive farming alone. Some scholars have argued that these details reflect not a lost super-civilization, but Plato's idealized projection of the most advanced techniques he knew from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Greek world. In this reading, Atlantis is a composite, a greatest hits compilation of ancient engineering, assembled into a single fictional society and amplified to mythic proportions. Others have taken a different path entirely. If the technology described by Plato seems too advanced for the ancient world, they argue perhaps its source was not of this world at all. This is the threshold where scholarship ends and speculation begins. The border territory, where the mystery of Atlantis intersects with questions about the limits of human achievement in deep antiquity. We will walk that border later in our journey. For now, it is enough to sit with the strangeness of what Plato described. A city where the water ran hot and cold from sacred springs, where the walls caught the last light of the sun in a metal that modern chemistry has only recently confirmed was real, where ships moved through tunnels beneath bridges, wide enough for chariots. Whether this city was memory or invention, it was described by a man who understood engineering well enough to make the details cohere. The measurements work. The hydraulics function. The military logistics, while extravagant, are internally consistent. Whatever Atlantis was, a real place, a philosophical construction, a distorted echo of something that once existed. It was built, on the page at least, by a mind that knew how civilizations actually operate. And that is perhaps the deepest mystery of all. Not the orichalcum, not the rings, not the golden temple, but the question of why a philosopher would go to such extraordinary lengths to make a fiction feel like a blueprint, or why a memory, if that is what it was, would survive so many centuries of retelling with its engineering still intact. Chapter 6. The Fall, Hubris, War and Divine Judgment. For many generations, the divine nature remained strong in the kings of Atlantis. They were gentle with their power. The enormous wealth that surrounded them, the gold, the orichalcum, the abundant harvests, the ships that filled the harbors, did not corrupt their judgment. They understood, Plato tells us, that all of this could be multiplied by virtue, but diminished by greed. They looked upon their possessions with a kind of calm detachment, as though the gleaming walls and the great fleet and the cities that dotted the plain were not treasures to be hoarded, but gifts to be tended. They valued friendship above acquisition. They valued the bond between the 10 kingdoms above the ambition of any single throne. But Poseidon's blood was not infinite. With each generation, as the kings married mortal women and their children married mortals in turn, the divine portion grew thinner. It did not vanish all at once. It faded the way color fades from a cloth left too long in the sun, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day the fabric is white and no one remembers what shade it used to be. The change expressed itself first in small ways. The rituals at the pillar of orichalcum grew shorter. The oaths sworn over the blood of the sacred bull were spoken with less conviction. The golden cups were still lifted, the libations still poured into the fire. But the spirit behind the gestures had begun to hollow out, the way a tree hollows from within while its bark remains unbroken. Plato's language at this point in the Critias is precise and sorrowful. He writes that the Atlanteans became unable to bear the burden of their good fortune. They grew visibly debased, although to those who had no discernment of true happiness, they appeared to be at the very height of their glory. More splendid, more powerful, more magnificent than ever before. This is one of the most quietly devastating observations in all of ancient philosophy. The Atlanteans looked their best at the very moment they had become their worst. The walls still gleamed. The harbors still bustled. The army was stronger than it had ever been. But the inner substance, the virtue, the restraint, the awareness that power is a responsibility rather than a right, had drained away like water from a cracked vessel. What replaced virtue was ambition. The kings of Atlantis, no longer content to rule their own vast and wealthy domain, turned their gaze eastward, toward the Mediterranean, toward the older civilizations that lined its coasts. They wanted more, not because they needed more, but because the appetite for expansion had become its own justification. Their fleets crossed the strait that separates the Atlantic from the inner sea. Their armies moved along the coasts of North Africa, pressing eastward through Libya as far as the borders of Egypt. In Europe, they advanced as far as Tyrrhenia, the region the Romans would later call Etruria, on the western coast of Italy. The known world trembled under the weight of their advance. And then they reached Athens. Not the Athens of Plato's day, marble temples and philosophical schools and the long shadow of the Parthenon. but a far older Athens, a city that existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt. A city that the Egyptian priests described as virtuous, disciplined, and militarily superb. Athens stood alone. Its allies had fallen away or been conquered. The other peoples of the eastern Mediterranean had submitted to the Atlantean advance. But Athens refused. With a small force and a steadfast will, the ancient Athenians faced the full might of the island empire and defeated it. Plato gives almost no details of the war itself. There are no battle scenes, no descriptions of tactics or commanders, or the turning points of specific engagements. The victory of Athens is stated as a fact, not dramatized as a narrative, and perhaps that restraint is deliberate, because the war is not the point. The point is what came after. The gods had been watching. Zeus, father of the gods, looked down upon the corruption of the Atlantean kings, their greed, their aggression, their abandonment of the divine laws inscribed on the orichalcum pillar, and decided to act. He gathered the gods together in their most honored dwelling place, at the center of the universe, from which all things can be seen. And here the Critias stops. The text breaks off in the middle of a sentence, just as Zeus is about to speak. The most powerful god in the Greek pantheon opens his mouth to deliver judgment upon the most powerful civilization the world has ever known. And there is silence. The scroll ends. The sentence is never completed. We do not know what Zeus said. We do not know whether Plato intended a speech, a decree, a thunderbolt, or something more subtle. All we have is the account from the Timaeus, written earlier, which tells us the outcome in a single compressed passage. And that outcome is absolute. Violent earthquakes struck the island. Floods followed, wave after wave, pouring over the lowlands and into the rings of the capital. The ground itself seemed to lose its solidity, as though the earth were reclaiming what it had once given. In a single day and night of misfortune, Plato's phrase, quiet and terrible, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea. The warriors of Athens perished in the same catastrophe, swallowed by the earth in a parallel destruction that Plato mentions almost as an afterthought. The ancient city that had stood alone against the greatest empire in history vanished alongside its enemy, as though the gods could not punish one without erasing the other. Where the island had been, the sea became impassable. A shoal of mud spread across the surface, shallow and treacherous, blocking the passage of ships. For centuries afterward, according to the Egyptian priests, no vessel could navigate the waters beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The Atlantic, which had once been a highway for the greatest fleet in the world, became a barrier. And then, slowly, even the mud dissolved. The sea reclaimed its depth. The currents smoothed the surface. The last physical trace of Atlantis, if it had ever been there at all, disappeared beneath the patient weight of water and time. Nothing remained. No wreckage, no ruin, no monument, no inscription. Only the story, passed from priest to statesman to grandfather to boy to philosopher. There is something almost dreamlike about the way Plato tells this part of the tale. The destruction comes swiftly, but the language remains calm. There is no screaming, no panic, no desperate flight of refugees. The island simply goes under, the way a heavy stone goes under when dropped into still water. A brief disturbance, a ring of ripples, and then nothing. Perhaps that is the most unsettling detail of all. Not the violence of the destruction, but the completeness of the erasure. Other civilizations fall and leave ruins. Other empires collapse and leave successors. But Atlantis, in Plato's telling, left nothing behind. Nothing except the words of a philosopher, written on the far side of 24 centuries of silence, describing a world that may or may not have been there. The fire in the temple is out. The orichalcum has gone dark. The six-winged horses stand frozen in gold at the bottom of an ocean that no longer remembers their names. And somewhere above the surface, on a warm evening in Athens, a boy is listening to his grandfather tell a story about a place that disappeared before anyone could prove it had ever existed. That story is what survives, and whether it is history or parable, warning or elegy, it carries within it a weight that 2,500 years of scrutiny have not been able to lift. The island is gone. The question remains, and the sea, as always, keeps its counsel. Chapter 7. The Minoan Mirror, Thera, Knossos, and the Eruption. If Atlantis is a mirror, then the civilization it most resembles, the one that has caused scholars to look up from the text and say, quietly, that perhaps Plato was remembering something real, is the one that flourished on the island of Crete and the surrounding Aegean islands, beginning roughly 5,000 years ago. We call them the Minoans, a name borrowed from the mythical king Minos, though we do not know what they called themselves. Their script, known as Linear A, has never been deciphered. Their language remains a mystery. What survives is their art, their architecture, their trade goods scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, and the ruins of a palace so complex it may have inspired the myth of the labyrinth. That palace stood at Knossos, on the northern coast of Crete. The British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating it in 1900, and what he found astonished the world. Knossos was not a fortress. It was an open, sprawling complex of courtyards, storerooms, workshops, and ceremonial halls, decorated with vivid frescoes that depicted a world entirely unlike the war-obsessed cultures of the Greek mainland. The frescoes showed dolphins leaping through painted waves, young men and women vaulting over the backs of charging bulls in a ritual that no modern historian has fully explained, priestesses in tiered skirts carrying offerings through gardens, saffron gatherers bending over purple crocuses. The colors were bright, blues and reds and yellows that had survived beneath the rubble of 3,500 years. The Minoans were a maritime civilization. Their ships controlled the Aegean, and their trade networks reached as far as Egypt, Syria, and the western Mediterranean. They exported olive oil, wine, pottery, and textiles. They imported copper from Cyprus, tin from the west, gold and ivory from the Nile. Their harbors were busy with the traffic of a world that was smaller than and more interconnected than most people realize. They built with sophistication. Knossos had indoor plumbing, terracotta pipes that carried fresh water in and wastewater out, a system of drainage so advanced that engineers have studied it with genuine admiration. The palace had light wells, ventilation shafts, and multi-story construction using timber frames to absorb the shock of earthquakes, a feature that suggests long experience with seismic instability. Roughly 70 miles north of Crete in the Aegean Sea lay the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. In the early second millennium before the Common Era, Thera was home to a prosperous Minoan settlement called Akrotiri. Its streets were paved, its houses rose 2 and 3 stories tall, and its walls were covered with frescoes as fine as anything at Knossos. And then, sometime in the 16th century, before the Common Era, the exact date remains one of the most debated questions in Mediterranean archaeology, with estimates ranging from roughly 1627 to 1540. The volcano beneath Thera exploded. The eruption was one of the most violent in recorded history, rated 7 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, a scale that goes to 8. The explosion tore the center out of the island, creating a vast underwater caldera that filled with the sea. The eruption column rose tens of kilometers into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and altering weather patterns across the region. Pumice and ash rained down on the surrounding islands, burying Akrotiri under meters of volcanic debris, the way Vesuvius would bury Pompeii 16 centuries later. But Akrotiri was different from Pompeii in one crucial respect. No human remains have ever been found there. The inhabitants seem to have evacuated before the final cataclysm, warned perhaps by earlier tremors, or by the columns of smoke that must have risen from the mountain in the days before the eruption. They left behind their frescoes, their storage jars, their furniture, but they took themselves. The eruption generated massive tsunamis that struck the northern coast of Crete with devastating force. The waves would have destroyed harbors, flooded coastal settlements, and disrupted the trade networks that were the lifeblood of Minoan prosperity. Ashfall poisoned farmland. The psychological impact of watching a neighboring island tear itself apart must have shaken the foundations of a culture that regarded the sea as both provider and pathway. The Minoan civilization did not vanish overnight. The palaces on Crete were rebuilt. Trade continued at a diminished scale. But within a century or two of the eruption, the civilization that had dominated the Aegean for 1,000 years had collapsed. By roughly 1450 before the Common Era, the palaces were destroyed again by fire and invasion. The Mycenaean Greeks took control. It was the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos who first proposed, in 1939, that the Thera eruption was the historical event behind Plato's Atlantis story. The parallels were striking. An advanced island civilization, a maritime empire, a catastrophic natural disaster, a sudden disappearance from the stage of history. Even the geography contained echoes, if you allowed for the distortions of oral transmission across 1,000 years. Plato placed Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic. But if the story had originated in Egypt and been passed through centuries of Greek retelling, might the location have shifted? Might beyond the pillars have originally meant in the sea beyond Crete, or in the direction of the great ocean, and been literalized by later tellers who did not know the original geography? The timeline presents a similar puzzle. Plato said Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, deep in the last ice age, long before any known civilization. But if the Egyptian priests used a lunar calendar, as some scholars have suggested, and Solon or Plato mistook months for years, the date would shrink dramatically, landing squarely in the era of the Minoans. These are speculations, not proofs. No scholar can demonstrate with certainty that Plato's Atlantis is a distorted memory of the Minoan world. The scale is wrong. Atlantis was supposedly larger than a continent, while Crete is a modestly sized island. The political structure is different. The metals and materials do not match precisely. And Plato himself never mentions Crete or Thera in connection with the story. But the resonance persists. A civilization that built magnificent palaces and controlled the sea. An island destroyed by volcanic fury. A culture that vanished so completely that later Greeks remembered it only in myth, as the labyrinth, as the kingdom of Minos, as the home of the Minotaur, and now, perhaps, as the seed of the greatest legend of the ancient world. The frescoes of Akrotiri sleep beneath the pumice, their colors still vivid after 3.5 millennia. The caldera of Santorini fills with sunset light each evening, its cliffs curved like the walls of a ruined amphitheater. And somewhere in the silence between what the Minoans actually were and what Plato's story remembers, there is a space where history and myth have not yet finished their conversation. Chapter 8. the seekers, candidate locations across the world. The Minoan theory is the most respected, but it is far from the only one. For as long as the story of Atlantis has existed, people have tried to place it on a map. And the map they have drawn stretches from the shallow waters of the Caribbean to the frozen interior of Antarctica, from the sun-baked deserts of North Africa to the cold depths of the mid-Atlantic ridge. Every generation produces its own Atlantis hunters. Some are serious scholars. Some are amateur enthusiasts, driven by passion and satellite imagery. Some are dreamers, and some are showmen. But all of them share the same fundamental impulse: the conviction that Plato was describing a real place, and that the real place can be found if you look in the right direction, with the right tools. One of the most popular candidates in recent years is the Richa structure, a geological formation in the western Sahara Desert of Mauritania, known informally as the Eye of the Sahara. Seen from space, it is remarkable: a series of concentric rings, roughly 25 miles across, etched into the desert floor like the blueprint of a colossal city, viewed from an unimaginable height. The resemblance to Plato's description is immediately striking. Concentric rings, a central elevated area, dimensions that roughly match the measurements given in the Critias. Proponents argue that the Sahara was once much wetter than it is today, and that the Richat structure could have been surrounded by water during the early Holocene period, when the region supported lakes, rivers, and grasslands. But geologists have studied the Richat structure extensively, and their conclusions are sobering. The formation is approximately 100 million years old, a dome of molten rock that rose from deep within the earth and was eroded over geological time by wind and water into its current concentric shape. There is no archaeological evidence of human habitation at the site. No artifacts, no ruins, no tools, no pottery. The argument that the Atlantic Ocean once reached this far inland, flooding the structure into an island, is not supported by geological evidence. The Sahara has been a desert for millions of years, and while it was wetter in parts during the early Holocene, there is no credible data indicating that ocean water extended anywhere near the Richat area within the span of human civilization. Far to the east, off the southern coast of Japan, lies another candidate, the Yonaguni Monument, a submerged rock formation discovered in 1986 by a diver named Kihachiro Aratake. The structure features what appear to be terraces, steps, and flat surfaces cut at right angles, leading some observers to conclude that it is the work of human hands, perhaps the remnant of a civilization lost to rising seas. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus studied the site for years and argued that it was a man-made monument, possibly dating to a period when sea levels were low enough to expose it, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. But Robert Schoch of Boston University has countered that the formations are natural, shaped by tectonic and erosive processes common in underwater sandstone. The debate continues, unresolved. The Yonaguni Monument remains one of those places where the evidence is just ambiguous enough to sustain competing interpretations. Too regular to dismiss entirely. Too natural in its context to confirm as human construction. It is not Atlantis, but it is the kind of anomaly that keeps the search alive. Other candidates have come and gone over the centuries. The Azores, those volcanic islands in the mid-Atlantic, were once proposed as the peaks of a sunken continent, though modern oceanography has found no trace of a submerged landmass beneath them. Spartel Island, a shoal near the Strait of Gibraltar that was above water during the last ice age, has been suggested as a modest but geographically plausible alternative. Some theorists have placed Atlantis in the Caribbean, near the Bahamas, where the Bimini Road, a formation of rectangular limestone blocks on the shallow seabed, was discovered in 1968 and briefly hailed as a remnant of the lost civilization. Geological analysis later identified it as a natural beach rock formation, but the myth of Bimini persists in popular imagination. And then, there is the theory that reframes the question entirely. In the late 20th century, a growing body of research began to focus not on locating a specific island, but on a broader possibility: that the end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago, may have erased entire coastal civilizations from the human record. This idea gained scientific traction through the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first formally proposed in 2007 by Richard Firestone and colleagues. The hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid fragment struck or exploded over the northern hemisphere approximately 12,800 years ago, triggering wildfires, rapid cooling, and the collapse of the massive ice sheets that covered North America and northern Europe. The resulting meltwater would have poured into the oceans in catastrophic pulses, raising sea levels by meters within decades, fast enough to drown any settlement built along a coastline or on a low-lying island. The timeline aligns provocatively with Plato's placement of Atlantis around 9,600 years before Solon, which works out to roughly 11,600 years before the present. Writers like Graham Hancock and geologist Randall Carlson have popularized this framework, arguing that a sophisticated pre-Ice Age civilization could have existed along coastlines now deep underwater. Since the sea has risen by over 120 meters since the last glacial maximum, the argument goes, the archaeological evidence would be submerged far beyond the reach of conventional excavation. Mainstream archaeology has been cautious. The Younger Dryas impact remains a contested hypothesis. Some evidence supports it, other data contradicts it, and the scientific community has not reached consensus. The idea of a lost pre-Ice Age civilization is regarded by most professionals as speculative, though the underlying point about drowned coastlines and inaccessible evidence is increasingly acknowledged. What all these theories share, from the Richa structure to the Younger Dryas hypothesis, from Yonaguni to the Azores, is a common emotional architecture. Each begins with the same premise, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Each asks the same question: what if the world before our records began was more complex, more connected, more accomplished than we have been willing to believe? It is a question that science alone cannot fully answer because the sea does not return what it takes. The coastlines of 12,000 years ago are gone, submerged beneath fathoms of dark water where no archaeologist can easily dig. If there were cities there, and we do not know that there were, their remains lie in silence, buried under sediment and coral. And so the search continues, as it has for centuries, in satellite images and sonar scans, in academic journals and late-night documentaries. Whether the seekers are right or wrong, their persistence is itself a kind of testimony, a refusal to accept that the past is as small as the evidence we have so far recovered. Somewhere beneath the world we know, they believe, lies one we have forgotten. Chapter 9. Cities that were only legends: Troy, Mycenae, Babylon. There is a pattern in the history of archaeology that the seekers of Atlantis know well. A place exists in ancient literature, in poetry, in sacred texts, in travelers' chronicles. And for centuries, scholars regard it as fiction. The walls are too grand, the stories too saturated with gods and heroes to be real. And then someone picks up a shovel and finds it. Troy is the most famous example. For over 2,000 years, the city of Homer's Iliad, the walled fortress where Achilles fought Hector, where Priam wept for his son, where a wooden horse ended a 10-year siege, was considered a poetic invention. Scholars admired the verse and dismissed the geography. Heinrich Schliemann disagreed. A German businessman who had made his fortune in trade and spent his later years pursuing the passions of his childhood, Schliemann arrived in northwestern Turkey in 1870 with a copy of Homer in one hand and a conviction in the other. He chose a mound called Hisarlik, near the Dardanelles, and began to dig. What he found was not one city but 9, layer upon layer of settlement, stacked on top of each other like pages in a book written and rewritten over 3,000 years. The earliest layers dated to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The later ones extended into the Roman period. Troy had been built, destroyed, and rebuilt again and again on the same patch of earth. The layer known as Troy Sevenae, dating to roughly 1,200 years before the Common Era, showed signs of fire and violent destruction consistent with the period traditionally assigned to the Trojan War. Schliemann also unearthed a cache of gold jewelry and vessels that he called Priam's treasure, believing it belonged to the legendary king of Troy. Later analysis showed that the treasure predated Priam by several centuries, but the gold was real and the city was real, and the war, stripped of its divine machinery and poetic grandeur, had likely happened. Troy controlled the strait between the Aegean and the Black Sea, a position that made it wealthy and made it a target. Homer had been telling the truth, wrapped in meter and myth. Schliemann turned next to Mycenae, the city Homer called rich in gold, the seat of Agamemnon, king of kings, who had led the Greek coalition against Troy. Like Troy, Mycenae had been considered mythical. Its cyclopean walls, built of stones so massive that the ancients believed only giants could have moved them, were known to exist, but the city behind them was thought to be legend. In 1876, Schliemann excavated the royal graves within the citadel walls at Mycenae. What emerged from the earth was staggering. Golden death masks pressed over the faces of ancient kings, bronze swords inlaid with scenes of hunting and combat, necklaces of amber and amethyst, golden cups chased with images of bulls being captured in nets. One mask, with its serene closed eyes and carefully rendered beard, Schliemann declared to be the face of Agamemnon himself. He was wrong. The mask belonged to a ruler who had lived centuries before the traditional date of the Trojan War. But the civilization it revealed was undeniably real. Mycenae had ruled the Aegean during the Late Bronze Age, with a power that matched Homer's description. The Lion Gate still stands at the entrance to the citadel. 2 carved lions flanking a column, their heads long since lost, their bodies worn smooth by weather and the passage of 33 centuries. Beneath them, the Tholos tombs, great beehive-shaped chambers cut into the hillside, held the remains of a warrior aristocracy whose wealth and ambition had shaped the ancient Greek world. And then there was Babylon, the city of Nebuchadnezzar, of the Hanging Gardens, of the Tower of Babel, a name that had echoed through the Bible and through classical literature as the very emblem of human pride and divine punishment. By the 19th century, Babylon was a ruin in the Iraqi desert, its bricks carried off by local builders, its location known, but its grandeur forgotten. In 1899, the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey began a systematic excavation that would last nearly 2 decades. What he uncovered confirmed the ancient accounts in almost every detail. The Ishtar Gate, one of 8 gates into the city, rose from the dust in fragments of brilliant blue-glazed brick, decorated with rows of bulls and dragons in raised relief. Behind the gate stretched the processional way, a broad avenue lined with glazed lions that had once glowed in the sunlight of Mesopotamia. Beyond it lay the remains of palaces, temples, and a great ziggurat called Etemenanki, a stepped pyramid dedicated to the god Marduk that may have been the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Babylon had given the world one of its earliest legal codes, the Code of Hammurabi, carved in cuneiform around 1754 before the Common Era. Its astronomers tracked the movements of the planets with a precision that would not be matched for centuries. Its engineers built canals that irrigated the Fertile Crescent and sustained a population that may have reached 200,000 at the city's peak. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, and their location has never been conclusively confirmed, would have been terraced structures irrigated by some form of mechanical water-lifting device, a marvel of engineering in a landscape where rain was scarce. Some scholars now believe the gardens may have been located not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, where similar structures have been documented. Troy, Mycenae, Babylon. 3 cities that lived in literature for centuries before they were found in the ground. 3 names that scholars had relegated to myth until the evidence became undeniable. The pattern is clear, and the Atlantis seekers know it by heart. If Homer was right about Troy, and the Bible right about Babylon, then perhaps Plato was right about his island beyond the pillars. But there is a difference, and it is a crucial one. Troy left its walls. Mycenae left its gold. Babylon left its gates and its tablets and its legal codes. Each city, no matter how thoroughly it was destroyed, left something behind, some residue of stone or metal or writing that survived the centuries and waited for the archaeologist's brush. Atlantis, as far as anyone has been able to determine, left nothing. And that silence, that absolute, unbroken silence where there should be ruins, is either the strongest argument against the island's existence, or the most haunting evidence that whatever destroyed it was thorough, beyond the capacity of any natural disaster we have yet documented. The question hangs in the air like dust motes in a shaft of light. If myth can hide history, can history also hide beneath myth? And if so, how deep does one have to dig or dive before the boundary between story and stone finally dissolves? Chapter 10. Cities that vanished. Pompeii, Angkor, Petra. There are cities that disappeared not because they were mythical, but because the world turned against them. Cities that were real and populated and full of the sounds of daily life. Market noise, the scrape of a potter's wheel, the laughter of children in a courtyard. Until something happened. A volcano, a drought, a shift in the trade routes. And then, over years or centuries, or a single terrible afternoon, the life drained out of them and they fell silent. These cities matter to the Atlantis story, not because they prove the island existed, but because they demonstrate something Plato's account insists upon, that even the most brilliant civilizations are fragile. Begin with Pompeii. On the 24th of August in the year 79 of the Common Era, though recent evidence has suggested the eruption may have occurred in October, the mountain called Vesuvius, which had been quiet for so long that vineyards grew on its slopes, tore itself open and buried 2 Roman cities in a single day. Pompeii was a prosperous port of roughly 11,000 people, a place of taverns and bathhouses, painted villas and stone-paved streets, temples dedicated to Apollo and Isis, bakeries where bread was still rising when the ash began to fall. The eruption came in stages. First a rain of pumice, then pyroclastic surges that rolled down the mountain carrying superheated gas and debris at hundreds of miles per hour. Those who had not fled were killed almost instantly. Their bodies, encased in ash, decayed over centuries, leaving hollow cavities in the hardened rock. In the 18th century, excavators filled these cavities with plaster, creating ghostly casts of the dead. A mother curled around her child, a man covering his face, a dog straining at its chain. They are among the most haunting artifacts in all of archaeology. The city itself was preserved with an almost cruel perfection. Frescoes on the walls still showed their original colors: deep reds, vivid blues, the golden skin of mythological figures frozen in mid-gesture. Amphorae of wine stood in storerooms. Graffiti on the walls recorded love affairs, election slogans, and the price of bread. Pompeii was not a ruin. It was a moment, sealed in stone. Now move eastward, across oceans and centuries, to the forests of Cambodia. Here, between the 9th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, the Khmer Empire built a city called Angkor that was, at its peak, one of the largest urban centers on Earth. Its population may have reached 1 million, larger than any European city of the same period. Angkor Wat, the temple at the heart of the complex, remains the largest religious structure ever built. Its towers rise like stone lotuses above the jungle canopy, their surfaces carved with scenes from Hindu mythology. Armies clashing, celestial dancers turning. The great churning of the ocean of milk, in which gods and demons pull a serpent to extract the nectar of immortality. The Khmer engineers built an extraordinary water management system, vast reservoirs called barrays, canals, and channels that captured the monsoon rains and redistributed them across the rice paddies that fed the empire. The system was elegant and effective, but it was also brittle. When the climate shifted, severe droughts in the 14th century, followed by unusually violent monsoons, the infrastructure began to fail. Religious upheaval weakened the social order. Invasions from the Thai kingdom of Ayutthaya pressed the empire's borders. By the 15th century, the population had thinned. By the 16th, the city was abandoned, and the jungle began its slow, patient reclamation. Roots splitting the stones, vines pulling down the walls, trees growing through the roofs of temples that had once housed the prayers of 1 million souls. When the French explorer Henri Mouhot encountered Angkor in 1860, he found a city that seemed swallowed whole by the forest. Towers rose from the canopy. Stone faces stared out from behind curtains of hanging roots. The silence was total, except for the sound of birds and the dripping of condensation from leaves onto stones that had not felt a human footstep in 300 years. Now turn south and west to the desert canyon country of modern Jordan, where a narrow gorge called the Sick opens suddenly onto one of the most astonishing sights in the ancient world. The treasury of Petra, its facade carved directly into a cliff of rose-red sandstone, its columns and pediments emerging from the living rock as though the mountain itself had decided to become a temple. Petra was the capital of the Nabateans, a people who turned the desert into a garden through engineering brilliance. In a landscape where rain fell, perhaps a few times a year, they built dams, cisterns, ceramic pipes, and channels that captured every drop and distributed it through the city with remarkable precision. The system sustained 20,000 to 40,000 people in one of the driest places on Earth. The Nabateans grew wealthy from the trade routes that crossed their territory. Caravans carrying frankincense, myrrh, and spices from Arabia to the Mediterranean passed through Petra and paid handsomely for the privilege. The city's tombs, temples, and theaters were carved from the sandstone cliffs in a style that blended Hellenistic Egyptian, and Mesopotamian influences into something entirely its own. But when the Romans annexed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 of the Common Era, the trade routes began to shift. Maritime commerce replaced the overland caravans. Petra's economic foundation crumbled. Earthquakes in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th centuries shattered buildings and ruptured water systems. By the 12th century, the city was essentially abandoned, known only to the local Bedouin who sheltered in its caves. The Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered Petra in 1812, disguising himself as a Muslim pilgrim to gain access to the region. What he found was a city frozen in the act of disappearing, its facades still sharp against the sky, its interiors filled with sand and silence, its water channels dry and cracked like the veins of a body from which the blood has long since drained. Pompeii, Angkor, Petra. 3 cities that vanished, one in a day, one over centuries, one in the slow erosion of relevance and rainfall. Each was real. Each depended on systems, volcanic soil, monsoon water, desert trade, that could sustain life magnificently until the conditions changed, and then could sustain nothing at all. Their fates echo Plato's Atlantis in ways that are difficult to ignore. The concentric water channels of Angkor recall the rings of the Atlantean capital. The buried perfection of Pompeii mirrors the sudden, total disappearance that Plato described. Petra's mastery of water in a hostile landscape resonates with the aqueducts and springs of the Citadel Island. But unlike Atlantis, these cities left their bones behind. Their stones can be touched. Their inscriptions can be read. Their dead can be mourned. They remind us that civilizations do not need to be mythical to be lost, and that even the most vibrant places can fall silent when the conditions that sustained them change. The line between a city that was found and a city that was never found may be nothing more than the depth of the water, or the thickness of the ash, or the patience of the forest that grew up quietly where the streets used to be. Chapter 11. Star Visitors and Flood Memories, the Fringe Theories. In 1968, a Swiss hotel manager named Erich von Däniken published a book called Chariots of the Gods. Its central argument was provocative and simple. The great achievements of the ancient world, the pyramids of Giza, the Nazca lines of Peru, the stone heads of Easter Island, the precision-cut blocks of Puma Punku in Bolivia, were too advanced to have been accomplished by human beings alone. Von Däniken proposed that extraterrestrial visitors had come to Earth in the distant past, shared their knowledge with primitive civilizations, and then departed, leaving behind the monuments and myths that we have been struggling to explain ever since. The gods of ancient religions, he suggested, were not supernatural beings but flesh and blood aliens, remembered through the distorting lens of centuries of oral tradition. The book sold millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. It was attacked by scholars and embraced by readers who felt that mainstream archaeology was too dismissive of the genuinely mysterious elements of the ancient record. And Atlantis, with its impossible engineering and its mysterious metal and its sudden catastrophic end, fit neatly into the framework that von Däniken had constructed. If the Atlanteans had built concentric canals and navigable harbors, and a temple clad in orichalcum and gold, perhaps they had not done so alone. Perhaps, the argument went, the knowledge came from beyond Earth, from visitors who recognized the island as a strategic location and used it as a base for contact with the developing civilizations of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. This idea has never gained acceptance within mainstream science. There is no physical evidence of extraterrestrial contact at any archaeological site on Earth. The engineering achievements of the ancient world, while remarkable, can be explained by the ingenuity and labor of human beings working with the tools and materials available to them. The pyramids were built by organized workforces, not by visitors from the stars. But the appeal of the ancient astronaut theory has never depended on academic approval. It speaks to something deeper, a sense that the ancient world contains mysteries that have not been adequately explained, that the gap between what our ancestors supposedly knew and what they built is sometimes too wide to bridge with conventional tools alone. And there is one site that has given even cautious scholars reason to pause. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found was extraordinary. Massive stone pillars carved with animal reliefs and arranged in concentric circles, dating to approximately 9,600 years before the Common Era. That date is significant. It places Göbekli Tepe at the very beginning of the Neolithic period, before the invention of pottery, before the development of agriculture, before the construction of any known city. The people who carved and erected those pillars, some weighing over 10 tons, were, by every previous assumption, hunter-gatherers living in small mobile groups without permanent settlements. And yet they built a monument of a scale and sophistication that was not supposed to be possible at that stage of human development. Göbekli Tepe did not prove the existence of Atlantis, but it proved that the conventional timeline of human achievement contained at least one major gap, a place where something happened that we did not expect and still do not fully understand. The fringe theorists seized upon Göbekli Tepe as evidence that a lost civilization had existed before the Ice Age ended, and that its knowledge had been transmitted. Through survivors, through migrants, through contact with beings from elsewhere, to the peoples who built the first temples and planted the first crops. Atlantis, in this reading, was the name given to the headquarters of that lost world. Running alongside the ancient astronaut theories is another current, quieter, older, and rooted not in speculation about extraterrestrials, but in the remarkable consistency of flood myths across cultures. The Sumerians told of Ziusudra, who survived a great deluge sent by the gods. The Hebrews told of Noah. The Hindus told of Manu, saved by a fish who guided his boat through rising waters. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztec recorded cycles of world destruction and renewal in which floods played a central role. In the traditions of the Pacific Islands, stories of sunken lands and catastrophic waves appear with striking regularity. Even in the myths of inland peoples, the memory of a great flood surfaces again and again, as though the story were older than any single culture. Some of these parallels can be explained by the shared human experience of river flooding, tsunamis, and coastal inundation. Others may reflect the very real sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age, when the oceans climbed over 100 meters and drowned coastlines inhabited for millennia. People who lived through that slow but relentless drowning would have had stories to tell. And those stories would have been carried forward in every direction, reshaped by each culture that received them until the original event became unrecognizable, transformed from memory into myth. The question is whether these stories share a common root, whether there was a single catastrophic event or a series of events that affected enough of the world's population to become a universal memory, and whether Atlantis, as Plato described it, might be the Greek version of that memory. an island civilization destroyed by the same forces that reshaped coastlines from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. The Mesoamerican figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, sometimes described as a pale stranger who arrived from across the sea bearing gifts of knowledge, has been interpreted by fringe theorists as a survivor of Atlantis, carrying fragments of lost technology to the peoples of the New World. Mainstream anthropology regards this reading as a misinterpretation of indigenous mythology through a Western lens. In the Vedic texts of India, references to flying vehicles called vimanas, chariots of the gods that moved through the air with the speed of thought, have been cited as evidence of advanced technology in deep antiquity. These texts are ancient, complex, and open to many interpretations, and the leap from poetic mythology to technological description requires a faith that scholarship is not designed to provide. What holds all these theories together, from von Däniken to the flood myths, from Göbekli Tepe to the Vimanas, is not evidence in the scientific sense but a persistent feeling that the story of human civilization is longer and stranger than the textbooks allow, that the world before our records is not empty but merely unread, its pages scattered by time and water. Whether this feeling is intuition or wishful thinking, it has shaped the way millions of people engage with the past. The television series Ancient Aliens, which has aired since 2010, has brought these ideas to a global audience, exploring connections between ancient sites and the possibility of extraterrestrial contact with an enthusiasm that academic archaeology finds frustrating and the public finds irresistible. Atlantis lives at the center of this conversation, not as a proven fact, not as a discredited fiction, but as a symbol of the suspicion that we have lost something important, that the world before memory was not primitive but accomplished, and that the evidence lies just beyond the reach of our current ability to recover it. Whether that suspicion will ever be confirmed is a question for the future. For now, it remains what it has always been: a candle burning in a window overlooking a very dark sea. Chapter 12. The Mirror in the Water. Why Atlantis Endures. We have traveled a long way together tonight. From a temple in Egypt to a philosopher's study in Athens. From the rings of a city that may never have existed to the caldera of a volcano that certainly did. From the golden masks of Mycenae to the silent towers of Angkor. From the desert cliffs of Petra to the cold depths of the Atlantic, where the seekers keep searching. And now, at the end of this journey, we arrive not at an answer, but at a question. The same question that Plato left unfinished 24 centuries ago, hanging in the air of a sentence that was never completed, a judgment that was never delivered. Why does this story endure? What is it about Atlantis that refuses to let go? Part of the answer lies in the history of the idea itself. Plato's account was discussed in antiquity, but it was the modern era that turned Atlantis into a global obsession. In 1882, a former United States congressman named Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, a book that argued, with passionate if uneven scholarship, that Atlantis was a real place and the source of all subsequent civilization. Donnelly proposed that the gods and goddesses of ancient mythology were the kings and queens of Atlantis, dimly remembered across the centuries. He traced similarities in language, architecture, agriculture, and religion across cultures on both sides of the Atlantic, and argued that they pointed to a common origin. The book was enormously popular, and it established the template that virtually every Atlantis theory since has followed. A few years later, the Russian-born mystic Helena Blavatsky incorporated Atlantis into her theosophical system. claiming that the Atlanteans were one of the root races of human spiritual evolution. Beings of immense psychic power who had destroyed themselves through the misuse of occult forces. Blavatsky's Atlantis was not archaeological but metaphysical, a chapter in the cosmic history of the soul. Even earlier, in 1627, the English philosopher Francis Bacon published New Atlantis, a utopian fiction describing an ideal society governed by scientists dedicated to expanding human knowledge. Bacon's Atlantis was not Plato's. It was a vision of the future, not a memory of the past, but it demonstrated the myth's versatility, its ability to serve as a vessel for whatever hopes a given era needed to express. And that, perhaps, is the deepest reason for the story's persistence. Atlantis is not a fixed idea. It is a mirror. Each generation looks into it and sees its own reflection, its own anxieties, its own ambitions, its own sense of what has been lost and what might still be recovered. In the age of empire, Atlantis was a lost empire. In the age of technology, it was a lost technology. In the age of environmental anxiety, it is a drowned world, a parable of climate catastrophe that feels less like ancient myth and more like tomorrow's headline. The story adapts because the fear it touches is universal, that what we have built can be taken away. Plato understood this. His Atlantis was never merely a geography lesson. It was a meditation on the relationship between power and virtue, between wealth and wisdom, between the capacity to build and the tendency to overreach. The Atlanteans had everything: divine ancestry, abundant resources, unmatched technology, dominion over the seas. And they lost it all because they forgot what mattered. That forgetting is the heart of the story. Not the earthquake, not the flood, not the mud that choked the sea lanes. The forgetting. The moment when the kings of Atlantis looked at their golden walls and their great fleet and their abundant harvests, and began to believe that these things were theirs by right rather than by grace. The moment when power became its own justification. Every civilization that has ever risen has faced that moment. Some have survived it, many have not. And the ones that fell, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Romans, the Khmer, the Nabateans, fell not because a god punished them, but because the systems they depended on were more fragile than they appeared, and because the human capacity for self-deception is in every age remarkably consistent. Atlantis gathers all of these stories into a single image, a shining city sinking beneath the waves, and holds it up for us to contemplate, not as history, necessarily, not as prophecy, but as a reminder that the distance between flourishing and ruin is shorter than we like to think, and that the sea is always there, patient and indifferent, waiting. The Critus ends in mid-sentence. Zeus opens his mouth to speak, and the text falls silent. We do not know what the king of the gods intended to say. Perhaps Plato did not know either. Perhaps the silence itself is the message. The recognition that some judgments are too large for language, and that a civilization's fall is best told not with a speech but with an absence, a door that closes without a sound. Tonight the ocean is dark. The stars are reflected on the surface of the water, and somewhere far below, in the cold and the pressure and the silence, there may or may not be the outline of something that was once a city. The evidence does not confirm it. The imagination cannot release it. And the story, told and retold across 24 centuries, continues to move through the world like a current beneath the surface, felt but never quite seen, shaping the shoreline of human thought without ever fully showing its face. If you have stayed with us this long, thank you. If the story has carried you somewhere quiet, then it has done its work. And if you would like to hear more stories like this one, slow journeys through the ancient and forgotten places of the world. You are welcome to stay. Subscribe if you wish, and we will meet again in another night, at the edge of another mystery. For now, let the story close the way all the best stories do, not with a conclusion, but with an image, a ship at anchor in still water, a lamp being lowered in a stone window, the last red glow of orichalcum fading from a wall that no one will ever see again, and the tide, steady and unhurried, drawing everything gently back into the dark. Good night.